So today we have a fun little video here. It's kind of a 4x4x4 musical experiment, and we have 4 tracks. We have a chord progression that is 4 bars long, and we have 4 different ways to play these 4 tracks. So to keep things simple, track 1, I want phrase-based library to give me a lot of realism and really exciting musical ideas, and we're using Sonokinetic's MIDI for that. Track 2, we're using the Orchestra 2, and this track will be just sustains. So nothing, no engines, no ostinato engines driving anything, just the orchestra's sustain patches, and we'll listen to that shortly. Track 3, the orchestra sounds, but the performance is going to come from scalar. So you can see here I've got the orchestra scalar performances, and that track has to be set to scalar as an input. All the other tracks can be set to normal default input, but this track, because it's driven by scalar, I set its input to scalar. So in that way, scalar's performance right here, and it's at Arco right now, but we have all the different performances inside scalar that we will drive the orchestra with on track 3. So that's what we want, a bunch of musical ideas from track 3. Track 4, we want a bunch of musical ideas also, but it's simply going to be using the performances inside of the engine of the orchestra. So all the ostinatos, all the rhythms, and the animated orchestra ideas. So that's what we want from track 4. So each track has a purpose, and the last 3 are muted right now. And MIDI, of course, all these tracks are going to be driven by the 4-bar chord progression, and that will tell all the engines, what to play and what chords to play their ostinatos and their musical ideas. So very flexible, very powerful little setup here with just these 4 tracks. Now to start with, we have MIDI set up, and for MIDI, well, first of all, I'll tell you that the chord progression itself came from scalar and its ideas from its modulation page here. So I click modulation button, takes us to this button, which I set to Neo-Riemannian, and that's just a very simple way to hear chords by ear, drag it down, hear some more chords, drag whatever musical idea. So it's a way to start with a scale, and this way I started a harmonic minor scale. And so the Neo-Riemannian system said, okay, so these are some musical ideas using this scale, and I just dragged them down and played around with it and dragged the ideas that I liked into the bottom bar here, and ended up with 4 chords that I thought would work for today's musical experiment. So that's where the 4-bar chord progression came from. Now let's just X out of there, and let's go and look at our first track. And on track 1, we have this musical phrase ready to go. I should mention that when I dragged the 4-bar progression into Cubase, I had to make one change with on the MIDI track, because MIDI needs all its input chords to be within this blue range here, and I had to drop this chord down 1 octave. So it's still musically going to fit, but it's just dropped down an octave just for the MIDI track, so it will play within its playable chord range. All right, just wanted to mention that. So here we have our first track, the rest are muted. We have MIDI ready to go with our musical idea, which are all these chords down here, these 4 chords. This note here is simply telling MIDI that I want to play, my first instrument I want to play is this. So I have other videos on how to use Sonokinetic products but basically I have one instrument ready to play these 4 chords, and that instrument is this. And if we look at it, we see this phrase is viola, cello, and bass, or double bass, and it's playing a 4-bar musical phrase. And if we X back out of that, we can play Cubase to play the 4 chords and hear it. So we can now tell Indy that we may want it to, we can mess around how it fades in and out of the different chords. So one chord may jump to the next chord a little too stiff or abruptly, so we can change the crossfade of those chords a little bit so you can play with it here. So I may just slow down the crossfade from one to the next and see how that sounds, and start it at the beginning. And that is a little smoother, so it's not jumping from one chord to the next harshly. It's more smoother by changing the X fade there. So I set up my first track to sound a little nicer and a little smoother, so we got that going. In the next segment of this video, we will get into the next 3 tracks. Alright, so on this next track, we're going to add in the sustains of the orchestra. So we can use any kind of sustaining sounds here, and we'll just start at the beginning with like a orchestral high sustain, and let's add that in. So we'll first just play track 1 again, and we'll add in the sustains. Alright, so right off the bat we have some sustains coming in to help our musical ideas. We could voice lead them a little bit, so we could take these chords and move just a little bit over. Just take maybe the odd one here and voice lead it into the next, just to give it more of kind of a fake legato, get those sustains carrying over to the next chord a little better. Let's see if that works. Alright, to my ears right now that sounds a little better. And now on track 3 we're going to introduce, we'll go to the orchestra scalar performance. So on this track we're going to, because it's set to scalar input, it's going to bring in a little variation of the arco performance from scalar playing a pizzicato. So it's going to have some pizzicato strings with a little bit of spice from a performance from scalar. And again, I'm just throwing out this first idea here. It could, you know, we'll start with arco and we'll move on from there. But it's introducing some musical ideas from scalar. So let's play it and add that in. So now we get a little bit of musical interest from arco. Alright, so now we have some pizzicato plucking in an arco performance here, just to add some interest. We can change that or get rid of it. It's just, we have all these expressions and performances available to add some musical interest in our ideas on track 3 now. Alright, let's go to track 4, and what that's going to bring to the table is the orchestra's own engine, and we have that set up for a string ostinato, some string movement in eighth notes, and that's going to even bring more string movement to this passage as a starting point. From here we can go to all the different rhythms, all the animated orchestras, and use the full engine of the orchestra and change up the instruments also that those use. So let's bring that in and we'll play it and then add that in. So I'm going to play it through a few more times and just turn on and off some of these tracks so that you see how they work together and what each track is bringing to the table. So let's keep playing it. Okay, so we have all these different musical ideas to play with now. And they're all, the glue that's tying this all together are these four bar chord progression on each track. And so what we want to do now in the next segment is start to play around with this and add some more musical ideas and ostinatos and see what happens. So this is where the fun really starts, when now we have all these engines set up in these four tracks. We can really begin to just have a lot of fun and just let the musical ideas start to flow here. So with indie, we have just this, one phrase going, but we could easily add some musical interest on, say, the last two bars. So if we draw in a note, it will tell indie. This note here tells indie that on bars 3 and 4, the last two bars of this chord progression, I want, say, we can, the string quartet playing something lively, and here we have the violins playing a nice little lively passage here, phrase, which should punch through all the other strings. It may be getting too cluttered, too busy, but that's not the point right now. We can turn some of these off and on, but we're going to add another element of a kind of lead violin line on bars 3 and 4, and let's just see how that sounds. So right away we've got some interesting little musical thing on track 2 of our indie phrase library here. And you can pan that and change that to come in at, operate how you like. But let's just continue on and say now, well, okay, track 2, let's, there's nothing stopping us from grabbing track 2 here and saying, okay, instead of just the high sustains, we can go with a more interesting sustains. We could go with we could go with the strings full winter sustain or any longer notes here. Or we could go with a mixed, bring in some more instruments. So mixed deep sustain. So that may, the string phrase that we just added is more upbeat. So let's stick with something a little not so dark. We could go and change it to, let's see, we could just bring in some choirs. That's kind of a mixed. We need more of a sustain, that's more of a staccato. Let's see what we got here. A lot to choose from. Now this is one I was just going to bring in a bunch of new instruments. So let's just try that and see how that sounds. I think what I'm going to do is just solo these two tracks, the first two tracks, and I'm going to go through a bunch of just sustained patches here and just see what I like and just experiment. So what I'm just doing here is I've added some sustained choir, and I just boosted the volume and changed their pan, because again, there's nothing stopping you once you find a patch you like, totally editing it, what instrument plays, where they're panned, and the reverb and everything. So just adjusted this sustain patch to how I like it, and okay, so now on track 3, there's nothing to stop us again from changing up the interest, a little bit of change. So if we go to our scalar performance orchestra, we can start now. If we're going to turn some of these, maybe mute some for it doesn't get too cluttered so we can hear what we're changing. But let's just start changing some of the performances here on track 3. Now again, this performance are playing pizzicatos, and we could change that instrument also to any instrument. So really, you're not constrained by anything here, and you could just turn it into light music, dark music, heavy percussion. You could go in any direction with these simple 4 tracks here. so let's change everything. And that was beautiful. I mean, just some really light and musical idea, which has no, you can just keep going with hundreds of different directions. And let's go with a totally different direction here just to show how flexible this is. So let's start on track 1. We're going to change these two instruments. So let's go back to Sonokinetic here. We're going to go in totally different directions. So we're going to go with a deep bass here. So let's hear what that sounds like. So just a deep bass, and that is cello and bass here. Yeah. So let's go with that. Let's turn up its volume a little bit. It's pretty low. You fade it in is fine for now. And on the second layer here, instead of this high-pitched string, let's go with something maybe totally different, a brass ensemble. Just choose one. Let's see how flexible this is. We'll crank that up a little bit. And let's just see what we have now just on track 1. So we're going to mute everything else and try to bring this together one piece at a time. Now there's one other thing you can do if you want even more harmony in your Sonokinetic Indie. Indie features a nice little added feature, well, that if I hit this button down here, and I have explained this in detail in another video, but I'm going to turn on its phrase coordinator here, where it's going to kind of, each phrase is going to be played more musically with the next. So I simply hold down this button, and I've got to, by velocity, turn all these on with a heavy velocity. So now these are all pink, which means as I add more phrase layers in Indie, they're going to play more musically together in a more harmonious way. All right, so let's just... Now we have a different musical idea totally on track 1, and let's continue to change it up here. So track 2 with our sustains should be this one, yeah. So now let's change the sustains from a choir string to something. We can go in any direction here also. Harmonic sustain. Just let's see what that sounds like. So now we may say we want some percussion in the background, some percussion. So let's use the orchestra and go with the percussion from the orchestra on, it should be right here. There it is. So instead of string eighths, we're going to say that we want orchestral rhythm, but we want something, you know, rhythmic that is going to bring in some percussion. So if we scroll down, we have all these new percussion instruments and rhythms. Let's just try one. Now these are pretty heavy, so you might, we'll have to maybe edit, but we'll see. these are pretty heavy duty. We can go into the main here and mute out some of it and just start and see where we go. Bringing in more and more tracks of that rhythm. So really an endless ways and pathways you can go from here. You could stay on track 1 and just go with some very beautiful and light musical ideas from indie, or you could go, use that just as some background interest and go heavy into percussion and war rhythms. Or you could go into just musical ideas using woodwinds, and really you have so many different pathways you can go from this point using just these 4 tracks set up like this with a 4-bar chord progression. So that's what I want to show in this video, how 4 tracks can take you almost anywhere musically. And then from there you could fine-tune so many different ways. Like as just one example, with indie, once you decide what instruments you want to play, and I'm just using just 2 instruments here. You could have up to 12 instruments played in all different kinds of ways using, and we didn't even get into the harmonic shifting where you have one instrument harmonically shifted from the rest, which even brings more kind of interest to your music. So that's it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch you on the next video.